Welcome, everyone. Very excited to have you all joining us for our Lunch and Learn. Today, we are going to be having an opportunity to learn more about human trafficking in Nova Scotia and to learn from the TESS Human Trafficking Task Force. Very excited to have an opportunity to learn from Kylee, who will be joining us. So with that, I'm going to take a moment first to begin with a land acknowledgement. And I want to invite you to join with me in this land acknowledgement. In the chat, please acknowledge the correct Indigenous name of where you are located. So if you go to placenames.mapdev.ca, that's one fabulous interactive resource. You can see it on the bottom right of your screen, or you can go to Google, but that one's nice because it helps you pronounce correctly where you're joining us from and just zero in on the specific town or location where you are so that you can look not at the colonial name, but to look at the Indigenous name that is the name of this land before colonization began. I also want to invite you, as we acknowledge this land, to take a moment to connect emotionally, spiritually, to feel gratitude for this land where you are. So perhaps you want to look outside if you've got a window. Perhaps you want to close your eyes and think of the land or the location. Maybe it's a garden, maybe it's a walking trail, maybe it is the beach, but somewhere where you feel especially connected to the land and grateful. Just take a moment to feel that gratitude. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. And let us also pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. When we acknowledge the land, we must also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truths. We are all treaty people. So how does this impact what we do and how we do it? And how will it guide our work together today? The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action by seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education. We commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Decolonizing ourselves and our practice means recognizing the ways in which we are each impacted by the colonial system in which we all participate and from which those of us of settler descent continue to benefit. Each of us, depending upon our social location and intersectional positionality, are uniquely impacted or oppressed. For example, those of us from African descent were dispossessed and uprooted from their land and brought to Turtle Island against their will as part of the white supremacy and slave trade that fueled the settlement of this continent. We take this moment to reflect upon the unique impact of colonization upon each of us and upon our practice. So where we are located are different aspects of our identity, some of which teach us what it's like to have power, and some of us teach us what it's like to have marginalized identity and oppression. And the quest is, how can we, in decolonizing ourselves, recognize the impact and the ways in which we are contributing to maintaining the status quo or working to uproot and change and working towards decolonizing, restorative justice, safer social work practice for all. The new Code of Ethics of the CASW requires us to work towards dismantling white supremacy that is everywhere and all intersectional bias. And so we commit to using our professional development both to learn new ways of thinking and understanding the work we do, and to unlearn assumptions and bias so that we can ensure safer social work practice and a more just world for all people. And we're grateful for this new ethics code that is requiring us to shift from the illusion of neutrality to actively becoming anti-racist and fighting against racism and all intersectional prejudice that is part of colonization. And so with that, very grateful to begin our Lunch and Learn and to introduce Kylee. So Kylee is going to now join us, and very excited to learn from her and the work that the TESS Trafficking Force is doing that we are going to learn all about. So I'm going to let her perhaps introduce herself more fully and share. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Naj. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Kylee. My pronouns are she and her. I am the research assistant for the TESS network in the Department of Advocacy and Community Response with the YWCA Halifax. I also have past and present experience working with restorative justice models. I work with the unhoused population here as well, and with survivors of gender-based violence. So I'm going to jump into my presentation. If I can figure out the screen sharing, bear with me. Okay. Naj, does that look okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing CSEC and trafficking in general, but also as it relates to the issue here in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kmaq, where I am. So before we begin, today's topic of discussion is challenging. I'm going to be using direct language with anecdotes of lived experience to talk about the issue of exploitation, sexual exploitation, and trafficking. Feel free to ask questions, pose questions in the chat or comments in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them when we get to it. Naj, thank you for the land acknowledgement. Again, I am joining from Mi'kmaq. And to begin, I like to ask questions for those who are doing social work on colonized land. So what are our rights and responsibilities in this work as they relate to reconciliation? And what is our place and privilege within systems? And to begin answering those questions, I always recommend having a look at the calls to action that are outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So TESS stands for the Trafficking and Exploitation Services System. It is a partnership of over 70 agencies across Nova Scotia that work together to respond to the commercial sexual exploitation of children and youth. TESS launched in 2016. It is hosted by the YWCA Halifax, and it's, again, a provincial partnership. So we have partners from really any agency across the province that may directly or indirectly encounter the issue of trafficking through their mandate. So especially folks who may work with vulnerable youth. We make collaborative connections among services. We set community-based priorities for action and build capacity through training for service providers. We bridge gaps between frontline and government, and we build public awareness about CSEC through social media and public engagement. We've also done some data collection and research on the issue that is relevant to this place. And so throughout this presentation today, I'll be referencing our Hearing Them reports, which were completed in 2021. So today we're going to look at understanding the sex trade and sex trafficking, identifying exploitation, risk factors and data, pathways to entry, warning signs, responding to disclosure, and resources for service providers. This issue is important for us to talk about here on this land because Nova Scotia currently has the highest provincial rate of police-reported human trafficking in Canada, and one of the highest rates of trafficking victims aged 12 to 17 in Canada. Now, police-reported data is going to be underrepresentative of the actual issue. As we know, with gender-based violence in general, it is very often unreported to police, and that will be the same with trafficking and sexual exploitation. So we have the highest numbers, and we also know that those numbers are realistically much higher. Commercial sexual exploitation of children. So we use the word CSEC to talk about it specifically, which differentiates that from labor trafficking and other types of human trafficking. It is the sexual activity involving a child under the age of 18, where there's been an exchange of money or something of value with the child and another person or group of persons. So it treats children as a commercial sexual object, and it is a form of violence and sexual abuse against children. And we do highlight there an exchange of something of value. So that could be an item or object that a youth wants. It could be housing, it could be transportation. There's a whole variety of things that we see exchanged for sexual services within trafficking and exploitation other than money. The adult commercial sex trade is a billion-dollar industry globally. There is sexual exploitation within this industry, although there is also folks who consensually choose to do sex work. And we'll talk a bit later about the spectrum of choice with engaging with the sex trade. There are laws that vary across the globe as to legality surrounding selling sex and purchasing sex. And it includes in-person and virtual sexual entertainment services. Now, the exploitation of youth does hide within the commercial adult sexual trade in ways that we often do not recognize. So we look at breaking down engagement with the sex trade as either trafficking, exploitation, or sex work. And the difference in the language really matters here, especially if we're working with folks. What we find very often is that, especially with youth, very few people early on will identify with the language of exploitation. So they may not see themselves as having been exploited, but it is important for us to understand the difference between these things and use the correct language when we're working with people directly or talking about the issue. So when we are looking at trafficking, that would be a third party having control over the subject. That it involves manipulation, coercion, and deceiving someone to participate in the trade. They have control over somebody's movement and money, and the trafficker materially benefits. Exploitation is a situation where people are treated like products or sexual objects. They're vulnerable due to lack of basic needs. We often think of exploitation being for folks under the age of 18, although anybody of any age can be exploited. And sex work would be somebody who has independent control of their working conditions, their ads and dates, and their money and their time. So a question that comes up often is really around that difference between trafficking and exploitation and which language we should use. Trafficking is always exploitation, but exploitation is not always trafficking. That helps to clear things up for folks. So with TESS, we developed the spectrum of choice to help people understand why and how people are engaging with the sex trade. So with trafficking, we see that as sometimes being a form of slavery or sexual exploitation. People are confined, they are blackmailed, they're threatened and forced. They could be kidnapped, and it is always controlled by a third party. There is either no choice or a perceived sense of choice in that situation. And then we have further to the right of this graphic, people who are doing sex work fully empowered and autonomous. They have access to other opportunity and an educated decision to participate. They're fully independent and there's an evident choice. What we see a lot of, I would say what we see the most of here in Nova Scotia would be survival sex. So people who have an economic dependency on doing sex work because they lack access to other opportunity. They may have been exploited or trafficked at a younger age, and they continue to engage in sex work because that is the best chance for their survival to meet their basic needs, is to continue with the sex trade because it makes better money than a lot of our part-time jobs here because our minimum wage is so low. So there's a sense of codependency there again, a lack of access to opportunity. There may or may not be a third party, and people are still often manipulated into participation in this context. We also see a lot of engagement through romantic involvement, so through intimate relationships and a partner coercing their partner into engagement with the sex trade. Through our Hearing Them surveys, we consulted with about 150 people who were currently or presently were adults who were currently or previously engaged with the sex trade. And so we asked them a variety of questions about how they became involved, what their experience was like while they were involved, and what they would need to leave or why they remained involved in the sex trade. What we heard from folks here, 83% again, is that the money is good. That tells us a lot about this issue and how connected it is to poverty and to lack of economic opportunities. 35% indicated that they continued to engage for their survival. So again, that survival sex work component, they were using it to ensure that they had food and shelter and their basic essential needs met. For many folks, it was to support substance use or because it was all that they knew. People very often feel sort of stuck in that situation. Again, 12% here identified that they didn't want a low-wage job. So one of the, sorry, just to backtrack a bit, when we're looking at supporting folks, and we'll talk a bit more about that later, but when we're looking at supporting people who are involved in the trade, we also need to be looking at what we need to realistically support them in addressing these things that keep them engaged, especially if they are in a position where they are looking to exit the trade. We need to be looking at providing them with education supports, housing supports, and all the things that they would need to meet those other basic needs in order to make that change. And we will chat a bit more later about that. So when we're learning to identify whether or not something is exploitative, we're looking at what degree of control or influence is held over the target. Is the relationship with a person in a position of trust or authority, such as a teacher, a doctor, or a police officer? And is the relationship with a person that withholds or provides essential services or meets essential needs, such as a guardian or a landlord or any other person in a position of power? And is sex being exchanged for basic needs or something of value, such as transportation, food, or rent? So we have here some images that highlight really the stereotypes about what sex trafficking looks like, and it absolutely 100% can look like this. More often than not, we see that it doesn't look like this. We see that relationships are built very slowly with traffickers or with people who have the intention to exploit another person. Usually it's somebody that they know. It can be a family member, again, an intimate partner. And there is often an element of perceived choice for people that is, they're really coerced into believing that they have a perceived choice in engaging with sex work. And I do want to also highlight that a lot of the images and ideas that we might have about what trafficking look like also really reinforce our ideas about what an ideal victim should look like as well. And so there's something that we need to unpack there with our stereotypes and our perceptions of who can be victimized and what victimization looks like. And it's important in this work to challenge our stereotypes and our biases around that so we can ensure we're not missing an opportunity to support people in a way that's holistic because of our bias. So how does this happen? So perpetrators of commercial sexual exploitation seek out vulnerabilities and they exploit them. So it's something that people do in a very patterned and intentional way. They're looking specifically for a target who has a visible vulnerability. Perhaps they're struggling economically or from a lower income household. Perhaps it's a youth that's growing up in a household where there's violence or a lack of support, where a exploitative person can sort of swoop in and begin the process of grooming that individual and building a close relationship with them. So the stages of exploitation are luring, grooming, recruitment, and then exploitation. There are quite literally manuals available for traffickers to learn this process. It's something that is shared and taught, and it begins with the luring component. So a vulnerable individual is identified and engaged. So again, somebody's looking for a young person or a vulnerable person who might be more easily targeted or persuaded. Then grooming begins. So a relationship is formed with the victim and the perpetrator through promises for the future, intense needs fulfillment. So we would look at that as love bombing. Those first two stages, we also would see within, intimate partner violence and other types of abusive dynamics within intimate or familial relationships. With sexual exploitation, it moves on to recruitment. So the idea of working in the commercial sex trade is introduced. The harms are minimized and material reward is amplified. There are many components of our culture that have normalized sex work, or as it should be normalized, but it is those elements of normalization are often weaponized by traffickers also for very young people to convince them, this is something that you should do. It's going to be great. It's going to be glamorous and it's going to be really fun. Then exploitation occurs. So a perpetrator isolates a victim, limits their freedoms, and takes control of their working conditions and money through psychological and or physical violence. So they begin utilizing coercive control, threats of violence or literal violence to make sure that a person is remaining engaged and remaining under their control. I do want to mention that the term grooming is being used a lot lately, and it's actually being weaponized against trans and 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. It is that is overtly transphobic, and TESS takes the stance that we're very against the weaponization of that term, especially because grooming is such a pervasive issue across the country, and we're really working very hard to address that and to work towards decreasing grooming and having people have an awareness over what this term actually means. So that's something that we're working on advocating for, and we'll be speaking more about in the future. We have here some diagrams about just sort of like what the process of grooming and luring looks like to simplify it. So one of the pathways to entry would be through romantic involvement. So a third party identifies a vulnerable youth. They shower that youth with love, attention, and gifts, and they establish themselves as maybe their boyfriend or their partner. They might gaslight the youth about the money that's being spent on them, and they convince them that sex work is no big deal. That's how they make great money. Again, it's going to be fun. It's going to be glamorous. They use violence and or emotional abuse to keep the youth entrenched at this point, and they take control of their working conditions and their money. Another pathway would be through economic insecurity. So if an individual is unable to access gainful employment, they're struggling with getting the money that they need. A friend may tell them how to do sex work online. An individual places an ad online and somebody, and then it could be a sugar daddy who pays for an agreed upon amount each time they meet. And then technically this other person has control over their time and their financial circumstances. So online luring is something that we're seeing happening a lot more often, and it's a bit, something we would like to do some research on in the future through TESS. The last time that we would have done sort of our hearing them survey in 2021, certainly online luring was beginning to happen. But especially since the pandemic, this issue has grown and expanded. And we do see a lot of predatory behavior on social media apps directed towards youth, like TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat, etc. So another pathway would be access to substances. So if a youth is seeking access to weed or alcohol, they might be introduced to some older guys who might provide them with these things in exchange for sexual acts. And a youth provides services to one or multiple people in exchange for substances, and they continue to access substances in this way. And it's not always necessarily very, obviously an exchange. Sometimes it's just that, the youth might figure out that, oh, if I go here and I do these sexual things with these people, then I get to party and I get to have the access to the substances that I want. And so they'll continue accessing substances in that way versus, it could be directly offered, hey, I'll give you alcohol if you do X, Y, Z. But it isn't always that way, so it's not always as obvious. So perpetrators use a variety of control tactics. They rely on coercive control to keep targets entrenched and engaged. They utilize physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, isolation, humiliation, and degradation, psychological violence. They withhold ID documents. They threaten the victim's family or their pets or the victim themselves. They intentionally create dependency. They force debt. And they project blame. There's a denial of privacy, branding and tattooing. So what happens very frequently actually is that this blackmailing that occurs where they will coerce a target into doing illegal acts. So they force debt on them in a variety of sometimes illegal ways. They may purchase property in the name of their victim. They may impregnate somebody and have children with that person. They may have them get an ID with a fake ID. So all of these things are, maybe acts that would have something legal tied to them. And then they will threaten them with, well, if you leave, I'm gonna report to the police that you got a fake ID, or if you leave, I'm gonna call CPS and have your kids taken away from you. So there's a variety of intentional tactics that are used where the legal system is actually engaged and weaponized by perpetrators to cause harm to survivors. We also very frequently do see trafficking and exploitation survivors becoming criminalized for this reason. And a part of that is that our, justice system still hasn't quite caught up to how to recognize coercive control. And this is what actually creates a lot of unsafety for survivors when they are trying to seek support and maybe get away from their perpetrator, is that there's a lack of safety for them to contact law enforcement because of past negative experiences they've had with law enforcement, or because of their own perceived or very real risk of being criminalized themselves for trying to access safety and support. So anyone can be targeted and anyone can experience exploitation. Victims are primarily girls and gender diverse people. Multiple factors contribute to risk and vulnerability, including poverty, family violence, and low self-esteem. Systemic oppression and inequities perpetuated by colonialism, racism, white supremacy, sexism, and ableism, those all increase risk and vulnerability for individuals and their whole communities. Individual risk factors combine with social and systemic vulnerabilities to create the highest risk. So while absolutely anyone can be a target, folks are at a higher risk depending on their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their racial identity, their history of trauma and sexual abuse or adverse childhood experiences, their lack of social support or problems at school, and then that sort of combines with risk through gender inequity, the legacy of colonization, systemic racism, community isolation, language barriers, and the hypersexualization of girls. The sort of like cultural normalization is also highlighted in the social and systemic component here. So it references masculinity norms and again, the hypersexualization. So the ways in which we have been taught to normalize violence against youth and children, and the way that we've been taught to view children as property, the way that we've been taught to sexualize youth, those things all contribute to risk factors and contribute to CSEC being able to occur and sort of fly under the radar within the adult sex trade in the way that it does. When we spoke to folks here locally about their individual risk factors, so this came from people here in Nova Scotia, 49% of people identified that their personal risk factors were social or cultural, 61% unstable family, 30% school and community, 64% identified economic factors, 60% substance use, and 35% homelessness. This was in 2021. I'd be so interested to see these numbers and afraid really to see these numbers now as we see the rise of homelessness in our communities and across the country. Many folks had 5 or more of these risk factors identified for themselves personally. So most people had intersecting risk factors there. So we also have some, sorry folks, we have some information regarding what they traded services for. So a great percentage of people that did trade services for things other than cash here. Family were involved and influenced in some way for many people. And 54.6% were under the age of 18 when they first became involved. So they were children and youth when they first became engaged. We often think of trafficking in particular as being an issue that happens within cities. But here in Nova Scotia, we see one of the greatest barriers is transportation and isolation in rural communities. And there's a real increased vulnerability for youth who may not have family supports and also don't have access to transportation. Through TESS, we do a lot of sort of adjacent advocacy for things like increased and improved transportation in rural communities, because it does so greatly impact the reduction of exploitation. The systemic influences here in Nova Scotia that we learned about were that 84% of those we surveyed had experienced physical violence, 61.4% had experienced sexual abuse, and 82.6% had witnessed physical or emotional abuse in their homes. We have a disproportionate representation of people who've had engagement with child welfare or, have lived in residential care as children represented in survivors. Many youth have been incarcerated as kids as well. And we also see an overrepresentation of African Nova Scotian, Black and Indigenous folks within those who have been targeted in our province and those who have been victimized. We also see an overrepresentation of youth who are 2S LGBTQIA+. 98% of, again, mostly girls and gender diverse folks are targeted. So 98% of those we surveyed were women or gender diverse. We also got some lots of really amazing anecdotal information from survivors here about why they became engaged. So this is some quotes that we have directly from survivors. And all of this training actually is that we provide through TESS is informed directly from those with lived experience. So it's a great honor and privilege to be able to present that information today. So we heard from people that opportunities were magnified and that they were promised a lot of money and they thought that things were going to be really great. And so they were kind of sold something that was unrealistic. We heard from people that they were kicked out of their homes. They weren't talking to their parents. They were using substances and they needed money. People hyped it up like it was going to be easy and glamorous. Again, other comments around substance use. We have someone here who said they came from an adopted family and they got kicked out for being gay. So through these direct quotes, we can also really see here why LGBT youth will be overrepresented because they so often lack family support because of the stigma and discrimination that they're facing within their communities. For those of us who are working with youth or with young adults and adults, when we're looking for the warning signs or what should we be looking out for is what we're going to kind of chat about next. So personal information, the age, their name might change with each telling of their story. They may respond to conversations as if they're reading a script. They may have repeated phone calls from a boyfriend or a blocked unknown number. They may start to adopt slang from the game. Which is what is the slang term to refer to the sex trade. They maintain a high level of secrecy about where they've been and who they've been with. They're secretive about online and cell phone activity, and they may have unexplained sort of mood swings or emotional outbursts. All of these signs that we're going to look over may or may not indicate that somebody may have experienced trafficking or exploitation, but they can be warning signs. And so when we see these warning signs, when we're working with youth, we want to try and get a little bit more information, or at the very least begin to create a safe space for that youth so that they know that they're an adult that's trusted that they can come to. So behaviorally speaking, we're looking at a youth frequently disappearing or going missing for extended periods of time, regular out-of-town trips, withdrawing from friends or previously loved activities and routines. They may have an online relationship with someone that they have not met. They may have significantly older partner, or they may be interested in older men. There may be excessive concern about displeasing a new partner, and they may be struggling with addictions or have a new addiction emerging. They may respond to questions as if they're reading a script or exhibit behaviors that we would associate with anxiety or high stress situations or trauma or PTSD. In terms of appearance, they may be hyper-focused on their body image or their physical appearance. They may have a new look or always be wearing new clothes. So as a part of the grooming component, with the love bombing, there's going to be often a lot of gift giving, which can include paying to have someone's hair or nails done or buying them new clothing. A new tattoo that the youth is reluctant to explain may be the result of tattooing or branding by a pimp, or unexplained injuries or bruises as an indicator that they may be experiencing physical violence. If disclosure does occur when you are working with the youth, the best thing that we can do is not to panic. As service providers, and especially, as adults with more life experience, we may recognize that a youth is in a very dangerous situation. And oftentimes it's going to be the case that that youth has a very different perception of their circumstances. And when we sort of react with a very strong projection of, our idea of or knowledge about the situation that they're in, sometimes this can sever a relationship with the youth. So what we want to do is, allow the youth to lead the conversation and allow the youth to lead their own decision making, while also trying to create safety for that youth in both the relationship that we have with them, as well as looking to assess their risk of immediate harm. Again, be mindful of your body language. Don't expect youth to present themselves as victims in need of rescuing. They're very likely to protect their abuser or their trafficker or their pimp. You're going to want to assess your duty to report. So here for most in Nova Scotia, it's for anyone under the age of 16 that we have a duty to report to Child Protection Services, but definitely consult with your team lead and your management team on how you should be addressing your duty to report within your role. Be transparent with the youth about your professional boundaries and confidentiality. So as we all know, within any client relationship, it's very important that we tell them up front where we will need to, report to another third party, or what is going to stay between you and the person that you're working with. Meet the youth where they're at. Again, gather relevant information only. So asking too many questions, disputing facts, or commenting on motivation is often an unhelpful approach. It can be very tempting to try and convince a youth that the person that they're dating is a really bad person and they're, again, in danger. Oftentimes they have a very, usually a trauma bond with that person. And so we want to be very delicate around working not to make suggestions about how they should feel about the person who is causing them harm. So as asking safety and risk of immediate harm, ask what is immediately needed and listen to the response. Try not to overpromise or offer unsolicited advice. And yeah, you can certainly, if you need to, call and ask about hypotheticals if you need to call CPS to get some hypothetical scenarios, talk to your team using hypotheticals if you need to, and practice self-care and mindfulness. You are not solely responsible to meet all of the needs of this youth, and in fact, that's not going to be possible, especially when we consider the root causes of this issue, and we can see that it really is going to take a community of support to so yeah, to help this person to move forward from the experience that they're having. So with calling child welfare, some considerations to make is, again, is the youth under the age of 16? Is the youth in immediate risk of danger or harm? Are there other youth under the age of 16 involved, in which case that would also warrant a call? If they're between the age of 16 and 18, have they volunteered to have the file open? So, you can ask them about whether or not they do want to have that call placed. If the duty to report applies for the child and youth, the process, offer to make the call with them present. So being very transparent about what you need to do next and how you're going to be doing it is very important. Oftentimes our systems can replicate the harm that people experience through exploitation or through intimate partner violence. For example, anyone who's in an abusive and coercive dynamic is living in a situation where they don't have choice over, where they go, who they talk to, often their finances, etc. So when our systems replicate a lack of choice, it's very traumatizing for people. So if you're uncertain of the duty of report, you can, again, call Child Protective Services using hypotheticals. In terms of phoning police, there's actually absolutely no duty to report to police whatsoever unless they're at immediate risk of danger or harm. So immediate risk of physical danger or harm. In that is the only case in which a call to 911 would legally need to be placed. If the police, things we would want to consider are whether or not the police actually feel safe for that youth. So again, for youth who've been, had a lot of adverse childhood experiences or who've already had to navigate systems throughout their lifetime, often there's going to be a great mistrust of police and others within legal professions. And so making sure that we are honoring and being sensitive to that youth's need for safety when we are considering or talking about whether or not to make that call. If the youth does want to bring charges forward and they are choosing to move forward with contacting police, it's important that we as adults help that youth to understand the process of launching an investigation. So we, through the YWCA, do work with youth who have been exploited or trafficked, and it is every time a very traumatizing experience for youth when their traffickers or exploiters are charged. Oftentimes it is difficult for the police to lay charges related to trafficking, and so they may have other sort of adjacent charges to try to prosecute that person, such as charges for domestic violence or related types of charges related to violence. And so sometimes it can feel really invalidating for youth when they see that charge list and there's not even a charge for trafficking on it, right? And so there's a lot of harm that can come to youth through that process, and making sure that they understand what that process will look like, making sure they understand how long it's going to take, and also doing our diligence to make sure that they have supportive adults and professionals who know how to navigate systems at their side if they are choosing to move forward with that. We do have some numbers there listed related to Nova Scotia. Obviously, there's folks joining from all over here, so you'd have to check in with your team to see who the appropriate parties are to call where you're at, and also check in regarding the laws, because these laws are specific to Nova Scotia and Canada. So oftentimes we don't actually receive a disclosure or somebody directly indicating that they may be experiencing trafficking or exploitation. And so a common question is, well, what do we do if we just suspect it? So at first, you're going to assess your role and responsibility in the situation. So check in with your supervisor or manager regarding your policies, your best practices, and the laws. So you're going to want to prepare yourself in anticipation of potentially having a disclosure down the road or knowing how to best support someone. Remember to work within your scope and your role, so not over-promising, because offering solutions that you can't follow through on can cause more harm. And if they're under 16, assess your duty to report. Secondly, you're going to want to create really supportive conditions. So facilitate a trauma-informed and non-judgmental space. Ask open-ended questions to build a dialogue. And it is okay to ask direct questions in response to cues in conversation. So sometimes we're afraid to directly ask somebody, oh, so are you doing sex work? Because we don't, maybe if they're not, we don't want them to be offended, or we have an idea that they might be offended. The worst that's going to happen in that case is that they may be offended, or they may say, no, I'm not, or you got it wrong, right? But if they are, then what you've done is you've told them that you're comfortable having a conversation about that. And you're opening a door to provide them further support, and to then say, okay, you know, especially if it's an adult you're working with, for example, so you are doing sex work, how can I support you with that? How can I make sure that, you know, you have what you need to do that safely? It is also okay to ask, you know, if you're working with a youth and they're dating someone, you know, do you ever feel afraid of that person? That's a question that, you know, I've used when working with women or youth that I suspect may be experiencing violence. You can also directly ask if someone's telling you a story. You can also clarify the details of the story that you're telling them. So, or they're telling you. So, you know, so were you pressured into having sex in exchange for substances? Things to avoid is not to assume that someone identifies as a victim. So asking someone directly, like, so you're being exploited, isn't going to have the same result as asking somebody those other more direct, detail-oriented questions, because again, the language of exploitation is not something that everybody identifies with. The language of victimization is not something that everyone identifies with. And some people may not really fully understand what that word even means. And so it's best when you're working with folks, unless they begin to kind of bring that up, to begin with using different language. Yeah. So I am also going to review some sort of resources for service providers that are specific to Nova Scotia. You should certainly check in again with your networks around resources in your own provinces or territories, or wherever you may be tuning in from. But we here at the YWC Halifax, we have a service called NSTay. So this is actually a peer support program. So it is entirely led by people who have the lived experience of having been exploited or trafficked. It is a non-judgmental, survivor-informed harm reduction approach. And the program supports youth who are ages 13 to 24 who disclose that they're involved in a sexually exploitative situation, or if it's suspected that they might be being groomed or engaged in an exploitative situation. So sometimes, again, like if we're supporting folks and we're not sure, they haven't directly disclosed to us, there are still lots of places that we can refer them to get support in anticipation that they may be at risk for this experiencing this type of violence. So while the age catchment here is 13 to 24, our NSTay, our peer support workers do actually support adults as well. And this program is open to anyone of any gender. They offer one-on-one peer support, case management, housing support, systems navigation. They will attend court with somebody, accompany them to appointments, provide safety planning, and some like peer-to-peer counseling. So this would be a great referral if you do know someone who is looking to pursue charges against their perpetrator, because of the court support component here, to have, you know, another survivor who's already been through this, who's very knowledgeable at this point about systems, is a really powerful thing for individuals who are taking that step. We also offer the Safer Spaces program. So this is a safe house. It's an emergency transitional housing project for victims and survivors of commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. It provides participants with a comfortable and healing residential environment. It's basically a space where they can get back onto their feet after their experience. And the Safer Space staff offer one-on-one peer support, again, case management, housing support, court support, a lot of the things that the peer support workers would also provide. And the peer support workers usually always do work with the residents at the safe house as well. At this time, we have one safe house with 2 bedrooms and 1/3 sort of transitional bed that's held for emergency referrals from police. And then we have a second stages apartment where the participant would pay a very low fee for rent. That fee is then saved, and we would provide that, return that to them when they're set to move out, so they can use it for their damage deposit or whatever they need. Yeah, it's a really fantastic program. We have a family support worker with the YWCA Halifax. So the family support worker works directly with families and parents who are currently being of youth who are being exploited. or are perceived to be at risk. So oftentimes, obviously, this is a horribly challenging experience for parents who can see that their youth is being harmed and their youth is, maybe in denial, maybe sort of beginning to distance themselves from their parents. There's often a lot of tension within families during these times. So the family support worker is fantastic in terms of just supporting parents or guardians with knowing how to support their youth and knowing how to have supportive conversations with their youth. Parents' first instinct is usually always to like, okay, we got to call the police immediately. We have to, get this taken care of. We have to save my child, which is a very honest and normal response. Of course, for those that do work with youth directly, we know that that may not be what the youth wants, and that can sever the relationship further and create greater tension. So the family support worker consults with parents often on those tensions and those feelings that come up. They help with justice system navigation, facilitating group-based support and programs, navigating different agencies and parenting strategies. They also do provide a lot of presentations and things for youth, directly to youth in schools. We have our December 6th fund at the YWCA Halifax. So this is a non-interest bearing microloan program. So participants, anyone who is identifies as a woman or who is gender diverse is able to access this program if they're 18 and up and they're trying to leave an abusive or exploitative situation, or if they have done so in the past. So we don't ask questions for people who apply to access this program. If you apply to access this program, or if you're referred to access this program, it is assumed that you have at some point in your life experienced gender-based violence. We want to make it as accessible for people as possible and as trauma-informed as possible. Applicants who are outside of Halifax Regional Municipality may need to submit a referral form for another organization. So the loans will be used for housing, damage deposit, rent, phone, internet payments. So anything that's going to be helping a person get back on their feet, residentially speaking, once they have fled from violence. Some of our TESS partners that we appreciate and love would be TRAE, so the Trauma and Recovery for Exploited Youth, and GATE, Girls Against Trafficking and Exploitation. TRAE services are based upon an integrated foundation of professional competence designed to meet the spiritual, emotional, physical, and psychological needs of those recovering from trauma. So they do operate through a faith-based perspective. However, one does not need to be of faith or identify with any religious affiliation to access services there. GATE is hosted through the Elizabeth Fry Society of mainland Nova Scotia. They offer a toll-free number throughout the province, appointment and court appointments, harm reduction for addiction support, one-on-one wellness planning, and case management services. They also offer safe housing program as well. Similarly, they have folks with lived experience employed and working across the province to directly support survivors. We also are familiar with the Reset Society of Calgary. So Reset is a long-term wraparound program, wraparound support program for women aged 16 and above who have experienced exploitation or sex trafficking. Their programming extends services to those who are pregnant or women with children, or folks with children, as well as those experiencing co-occurring issues and challenges such as addictions, trauma, and homelessness. So they offer 2 stages of housing, supported housing and supported independent housing as well. So I would be very happy to take any questions that folks have. I know Notch has probably been monitoring the chat, but thank you for doing so.
Absolutely. So there's definitely been a lot of questions. So first of all,
awesome.
Thank you so very much. And a reminder to everyone that you are that we're in webinar. So please use the chat in order to be able to put your questions. So I'm going to read all the questions that I've had so far, and then we'll kind of take them one by one. So
sure.
The repeated one is copies of your slides.
Yeah,
Whether
absolutely.
Okay. So you sent them to me, so I put my email in the chat so that
Yeah,
people can contact me, but I also put the link to TESS, the Trafficking Exploitation Service System,
awesome.
in there. And I want to say also, just to take a second, and maybe we'll, if it's okay, just kind of open it up now so we can both be here. So I'm going to the IWK, I just want to let people know, IWK over the last few months started gathering together all different service providers to really begin thinking about public health issue around CSEC in particular. And so this work is really starting. So I just want to let people know that's happening, but I'm so grateful, Kylee, for you and what TESS is doing in particular, and check out that link. So aside for the slides, here are some of the questions. Questions about disability and neurodivergence and how that might contribute to someone's vulnerability. Question also about slang and about the game for people who don't know anything about the game, like maybe if you can say what that is a reference to. Then there was a question about providing safety for people who go to RCMP. So lots of different questions. So if they go to RCMP or local police, could there be no contact conditions that happen? Then another question that came to me privately was what happens when people might be aware of the police being really actively involved in this in some smaller communities. So that's something for those people who might be well-intentioned in wanting to contact the police to know about. Then there was another question, why Nova Scotia? Then there were some questions about counseling at NSTay, like what are the different counseling options available? Then there was a question about minimum age requirements for safer spaces. Then there were some questions about locations, like is it just in HRM? What happens with people who are elsewhere? You put a slide around something in Calgary. Some people want to leave Nova Scotia, so what can be done there? Also, are there pamphlets available was a question, like could people contact TESS to get pamphlets, for example? And then last but not least, in terms of questions that are coming at me is advocacy legislation to charge perpetrators more easily is the question. Those are all the questions that have come up while you were talking.
I love it.
Let's go back. The
we
slides,
usually,
feel free to, I'll put my questions again
yes,
in there.
absolutely. I'm going to go one question at a time, but starting with the slides. Yes, we would love to share the slides with you. TESS aims to be very open resource for folks. We really want to share this information. And so long as you're, providing credit for where you receive the information, feel free to use graphics in your own presentations. We really just want to get this information out there and accessible to people. And we want to have folks talking about the issue. Our website is also just a really fantastic resource. We have all of the hearing number reports that I've referenced, along with many other white papers are published on our website. So there's some really great reading there for anybody who'd like to know more. I will say I'm not used to only talking for an hour and trying to fit important information into a shorter time. We're usually take a day to present to folks. And so I love these questions because it gives me a chance to sort of fill in some of the gaps that I wasn't able to address. What was the next question, Naj?
So the first question is about disability neurodivergence as vulnerability that we should be thinking about or looking for.
We absolutely see that as an increased vulnerability or a risk factor. That was actually, we hosted training yesterday, and that was one of the questions that some of the service providers had. They were folks that work directly with youth, and they were seeing in schools that the youth that they worked with who may have some cognitive delays or neurodivergence were at a higher risk or were more likely to be experiencing this. So yes, that is a risk factor for youth. And yeah, I don't know if that fully answers the question, if there's anything else that I wanted to add to that. But.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the game and then
Mhm.
slang about the game as a risk factor to or something to be watching, and a lot of people
Yeah.
aren't familiar with
So
either.
the game will be slang for like the underground sex trade. So it will be referred to as the game, and then things outside of that are often referred to as like the square world. And yeah, that answers that one as well.
Thank you. And are there any other like slang terms that people should be aware of,
Um, I am,
or culturally appropriate, safe terms, better?
yeah, I believe we do have some slang terms listed on our website as well, Naj. So I'm going to see if I can find the page for that to share with you. Now, the thing about slang is that it's kind of continuously developing and evolving, especially with what youth are saying. So, a couple of years ago, TESS consulted with youth about the words that they were using to talk about trafficking and exploitation, because they're very different than the words that adults might use or people within academic settings, etc.
Mhm.
But I'm going to
Thank
make a note on that, and I'll follow up with you.
Yeah, and I think that your comment also around just the ways in which when we use words like commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking, that can be off-putting for people. So it's important to be
Yeah,
thinking about
it's
the
not
word.
accessible language, and so it's important to make sure within our work that we're using language that's accessible to people that we're working with.
So, speaking about safety, what happens in terms of contacting the RCMP in the ideal world, and then like in terms of how to keep someone safe if they do choose to engage in working with that, and then what happens if perhaps there's a concern that the police might be actually involved
Yeah.
in.
This is a great question. I think I'm going to answer it backwards. um, we absolutely do see a mistrust again among um, people who've been exploited or people who are in the trade of police officers. I do recognize that there are very good reasons for that that are rooted in systemic oppression, in particular of racialized communities. And we actually do have some data from participants as well. So actually, around twice the number of participants that we had surveyed had been assaulted by police officers. So twice the amount have been assaulted by police officers than have been assaulted by their pimps. And so it really outlines the need for safety and access to safety through justice that doesn't currently exist for survivors, and how the experiences of some also impact the experiences of many and of all of us, right? And so for that community to have distrust of law enforcement is again reasonable and rooted in history and in present day issues and oppression. So, as service providers, it's very important that we also hold an awareness of that, and regardless of our experiences with law enforcement, that we're not projecting that onto the people that we're working with. People that we work with are the experts in their own lived experience. We are not the experts, and so I guess my tip for working with folks who may anticipate that fear is to honor that fear and work around it as best you can. The uh, Something we commonly heard from survivors is that they wanted more non-police led responses for reporting and for accessing support and safety. So that is something that we currently lack. It's something that we currently don't have a lot of for folks. And so we do advocate within our work to have more non-police led services for things either directly related to trafficking or for other things, such as for mental health calls, right? Because not everybody feels safe phoning police. Now, I will say as well that our peer support workers have all built really great relationships with the RCMP and the trafficking team. So there is a specific team within the RCMP who are, they're the experts on trafficking within the RCMP department. They work across the province of Nova Scotia. And yeah, so our peer support workers have had great success in working with them to support folks. Usually you do need to make a call to the police within your jurisdiction. first. That's just sort of the way that policing works. And then ideally, in the ideal situation, the, you know, police would be contacted if people are looking to lay charges, or if there's like an incident of a missing person, things like that. So I
So
hope that fully answers the question. Maybe.
it's a start of one. But I think for today, I think like this, so the next question related
Mhm.
maybe is advocacy legislation about charging perpetrators more easily, but
Yeah.
potentially advocacy for creating maybe a special task force that is separate from one's local police if one
Hmm.
is supposed to report through one's local police, but potentially one's local police is actually maybe some people might be involved is one
Right.
of the questions.
Um, sorry, can you repeat that question or like shorten it,
So
reword it?
advocacy legislation to charge
Yes.
perpetrators more easily is, let's do that question. And then the other
Okay.
question is about uh, advocacy around a
Right.
separate reporting mechanism to the police that's not through
Yeah.
the.
Um, at this time, I can't think of a specific advocacy initiative that is currently directly um, working to improve that legislation. However, like generally speaking, TESS and the YWCA Halifax do get engaged in advocacy initiatives surrounding legislation when we're able to. So I don't know of anything right now that is being done specifically that I can reference as an initiative, but
But if
it's
a
something
social
that
worker wanted to contact you, they could.
yeah, absolutely. And we do more often advocate the and this is a personal perspective, that the legal system um, is very old. It was built a long time ago. It was created to protect certain people over others, right? And so that is sort of a very slow and uphill battle that we are continuously fighting. Something that we advocate for more presently would be those sort of supportive initiatives and preventative measures around the issue. So, advocating for better transportation, advocating for more services and supports that don't involve the legal system, things like that.
So before we get into some of the concrete questions, one other question that came to me privately is what happens when perhaps there's some child trafficking that people are aware of within child welfare per se?
Okay, so the implication there is that the child welfare are aware of it and they're in on it.
Or that in a house or in like some facility or something that there might be
Okay,
something.
so exploitation within a facility, yeah. Um, I don't fully know how to answer that one. That's a tricky question.
Larger advocacy goals.
Yeah, very larger advocacy goals. I know that there are. I think the process there is to, file a complaint with whichever revisory board is appropriate to file a complaint with, and speak to, the legal teams that would support your organization to find out what your best avenue for addressing that would be. That's my,
And
yeah, my experience so far would lead me to say that's the right direction, but some folks might have other answers.
awesome, thank you. And
Mhm.
it's worth noting that this conversation and this work is really just beginning, right? So, and
Yes.
IWK is just gathering a lot of the different providers to join and amplify what TESS is doing so that it's not just y'all on your own.
Yeah.
But the questions now are shifting to y'all on your own. So what are
Okay.
locations where this is happening? What is how much of this is only in HRM? Some of these questions came before you showed the other
Yeah.
locations, but
So
yeah.
to answer the location question, I think it's around 38% of um, people were that we surveyed within the hearing map surveys that were trafficked or exploited first in HRM, and the rest would have been in rural communities. So that's pulling the stat off the top of my head. You can definitely confirm it in the hearing them reports on our website. So it happens a lot in rural communities. And again, that would be because there's an increased vulnerability there that's easier for traffickers to exploit. People are isolated, people don't have access to transportation. It's easier to cut people off from their supportive networks when they live rurally. So it's a very big issue here, especially in the very northern and very southern part of our province where there's that additional isolation.
And that brings up the question, why Nova Scotia?
So I'm not sure if anybody who may be from Nova Scotia had seen, there was a report released within the last, I want to say 4 or 5 months, ranking the Canadian provinces on sort of how well they're doing on a variety of different, health and economic and wellness fronts. And Nova Scotia was ranked very, very low on that list, and we're doing very poorly in a variety of different areas, such as housing and wellness and healthcare and access to support and economic opportunity. And so those are a variety of reasons that contribute very, very heavily to increased risk factor for people. We know that, again, for youth who grow up with adverse childhood experiences, for youth who grow up in poverty, for youth who grow up with less economic, access to opportunity, people who grow up in isolation, these are all increasing their risk factors and layering risk factors on top of each other. So it is very much related to, I would say, very heavily to our economy and our status of housing here, access to housing and opportunity. The other aspect is that we also have very high rates of intimate partner and domestic violence here. We have very high rates of family violence in Nova Scotia. And so there's a lot of generational history here that leads us to having higher vulnerabilities as well, through, the normalization of and how common family violence or intimate partner violence is here.
Thank you. So the question was also around minimum age requirement for safer spaces.
I believe it is 18 and up. Yes.
And then a question about counseling at NSTay.
The counseling provided directly through NSTay is peer support. So it would be people with lived experience being able to talk to and provide emotional support for, someone who's going through it. There are also, however, relationships that we might have with other partnered organizations to provide more like counseling with like a clinical therapist or something, for example. So we have some options for referrals, but as for NSTay itself, it will be peer support. Yeah.
And that brings us to the last question. What volunteer and or paid opportunities are there for social workers to help in this field?
Well, we actually, so TESS, the partnership, we are constantly open to bringing in new partners to that work. So it is on our website. Pretty sure it's under the contact section, where if you scroll down, you can say, if you're interested in being a service provider, you fill this out to contact us. So basically, again, anybody can be a TESS partner who has, who's directly encountering this issue through their work or indirectly encountering the issue through their work, through their mandate. We are very happy to have people involved, and through being a TESS partner means that you'd be, invited to join on a variety, some of our, working groups or regional meetings in province. So this would be extended to folks who are living and working in Nova Scotia only, sadly, but basically, we have working groups that might be addressing some of these advocacy pieces. We are working with the IWK, as Nash has mentioned, to develop, to support them in their development of their population health approach to dealing with or addressing CSEC. Then we would also have regional groups where we might, invite folks from certain regions to information sessions, just to continue the conversation and see what folks need in different areas of the province.
Thank you. And the website is www.tessns.ca. And I put it in the chat again. And hopefully you're getting a lot of the gratitude that's coming here for how
I am seeing the
able
comments
to,
popping up, and they're making me feel great. Thank you, everybody.
So we are very grateful. The one last question is around any resources that can help people leave Nova Scotia if they feel like they
Hmm.
need to, was one of the questions.
Yeah, well, at this present moment, we do still have a case fund through TESS and the YWCA. So we have a pot of money that is specifically to help people who are fleeing the trade or a situation of trafficking or exploitation. We have historically and presently are still able to help with like travel costs if needed for people who are looking to move to a different part of the country for their safety or for their recovery and healing. And I'm hopeful that come like in future we'll be able to continue providing that service and support.
I just got asked whether it's possible to make donations to that or to any of
Yeah,
the funds.
100% it is. Yeah. I will, if you want to reach out to me personally, I can find out how you would go about making a donation. Um, I think we more frequently would make accept donations for our December 6th fund, but those funds are sort of co-managed. So sometimes we might use a different fund for a different situation, and often it is survivors of exploitation or trafficking are also accessing the December 6th fund.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much. We are so deeply grateful to you for sharing of your knowledge and wisdom. And there is
Yeah,
more.
thank you.
Some of the questions is what more education is going to be available? What other resources exist? We know that ABSW, for example, does some really important work as
Yeah,
well. And there's a
they
lot of
do.
providers that exist. And so what can we
Yeah.
how can we keep learning and unlearning our biases so that we can be better positioned to help?
I mean, there's lots of reading that you could do to further educate yourself on, what trafficking is and what it looks like. But I would actually suggest beginning with further learning on, anti-oppressive work and really positioning yourself in how you show up for your role as a social worker. Um, I think that gives us the foundational knowledge to approach supporting survivors in a way that is um, working towards being decolonized and anti-carceral and really holistic in the way that we work with people and communities. Um, in terms of further sort of resources, I will thank you for bringing up ABSW. You just reminded me. They're awesome. They have a number of staff and partners who've just gotten trained in the Not a Number training, which I want to mention to folks. Um, Not a Number is a program that's offered across North America, I believe, and Elizabeth Fry Society recently brought in those trainers to train service providers across Nova Scotia, and the Not a Number training basically certifies folks to work with survivors to train youth on, anti-trafficking and anti-exploitation material. So I know ABSW does have some staff who are trained. We have some staff here at the YWCA are trained. EFRI has some staff that are trained. So if you're looking for someone who can work with youth who has that skill set, certainly reach out to TESS and we'll connect you with somebody.
Thank you. It's so much. And you mentioned poverty as a driving force of all of this as
Yeah.
well, and some of those psychosocial and structural determinants of health, things like transportation. So just a reminder, we are going to be having a conference on Monday on the housing crisis. It'll be at HRM Central Library or virtual. So hopefully people will join us for that because with the current housing crisis, we know that there's an inflation and so many other problems. We
Yeah.
know that's the underlying piece as well as some of the intergenerational trauma pieces. So
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Poverty and homelessness are major contributors. And yeah, unfortunately, with the um, increase of both of those things that we're seeing right now, we're also going to, without a doubt, see an increase in exploitation. So we have to be aware of it and be responsive to it as best we can. It can be really tiresome for those of us who are working directly, with people and trying to support them when our systems are really lacking the supports that we need to even kind of pull into the situation. So um, hats off to those who do social work and deal with that reality every day. It's really challenging.
well, it is definitely a huge issue, and we are grateful to you for helping us expand our understanding and thinking about it. And there's some larger stuff. I just saw there was a Q&A as well. How perpetrators develop and
Hmm.
how they evolve. That's probably a
Yeah,
whole
it's a great
research unto
question. It's a
itself.
great question, actually. And I'm happy somebody asked it. Um, we aim to take an approach to the work that is not, um, aggressively villainizing of those who do perpetrate this type of harm, because we know from working with survivors and working with communities that oftentimes, young boys themselves are actually groomed into becoming pimps. Oftentimes, we see a lot of peer-to-peer recruitment with youth who have already been trafficked or exploited themselves, and then they teach their friends or they bring their friends into it. So the sort of image that we have of who a pimp is or who a perpetrator is not always realistic, and so we need to check our biases in that realm as well and learn to ask the question of why did somebody um, get into this to start with. And once we can start to unpack that, then we can begin to support people and advocate in ways that are really going to prevent the issue. We're always just responding to things with a punitive approach. We rarely get to the bottom of the problem.
Yeah, and I just got a couple of comments about how a lot of times they're victims as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
The complexity of the ways in which sexuality evolves in our
Hmm.
current society, and how it
Yeah.
is it evolves within us, and without safe outlets or healing from sexual trauma and
Yeah.
sexual reactivity, we see how it continues to
Yeah.
grow, and
Absolutely. Yeah. There's
so
a
much
lot
more
of
healing to do.
um, we need to be looking to the systems that exist, and I mean that both as the literal institutions and also systems that are um, oppressive, and they are belief systems, and there are so much of our beliefs and what is normalized in our society about gender and sexuality and identity contributes to the normalization of violence, and so that's really the starting point when we're trying to unpack this.
Blame and shame can sometimes
Hmm.
make it harder for the healing to happen.
Yes, absolutely.
That's a good note to end on, I
It
think, as
is. Thank
we
you so much, everyone,
hopefully
for
will
listening.
continue to learn and grow, and advocate for safer worlds for every single person. So thank you for everything you are doing. Thank you for educating us so that we can amplify your work in our respective areas of practice. And thank you to everyone who joined. And hopefully we will continue to do this work together. Thank you.
Thank you.